Welcome to Shredder Fanfic. Like, subscribe, and hype video. Join members to gain early access to new videos.
The main character, after dying inside of his previous life, he wakes up inside of Invincible, and inside of Invincible, he wakes up as Homelander. What is Homelander gonna do inside of Invincible?
My attention for the wrong reason. Compound V made leverage. It made bodies that could carry a brand through fire and come out smiling. It made loyalty easier to enforce because power given could become power threatened. The newest subject woke, strapped to a reinforced medical frame. He screamed when his bones reset. Nobody looked away. I had chosen the team carefully after the first failures. The weak ones were gone. The sentimental ones were gone. The ones who remained still flinched, but they kept notes while they did it. Vitals, I asked. Unstable, Dr. Patel said, but improving. Pain response. Extreme. Memory. She hesitated. Intact. I watched the subject's hands close around the restraints hard enough to bend them. Good, I said. Let him remember who gave him this. Behind him were 7 figures, standing unnaturally still on a stage that had been specially built for this moment by Vought Studios under his direct supervision. The Sups wore identical black and gold suits, designed specifically by Homelander himself, personally overseeing every detail. Their expressions looked frozen in time as they stood perfectly still on stage. Welcome, everyone, Homelander said with a smile that felt more like cold steel than anything human. Today marks the beginning of something truly special. The crowd erupted in applause. These 7 Sups, he continued, gesturing toward them with a hand that seemed far too large and powerful. They are the future of heroism. The audience cheered louder. They represent the pinnacle of human potential, Homelander said. With the help of Vought Studios and our groundbreaking Compound V technology, they are here today because we believe in them. The audience continued cheering louder. And they are here because we believe in you, Homelander added, looking directly at the camera. Together, we will build a brighter future. The crowd continued cheering louder. But beneath the surface, Homelander's mind churned with thoughts of how he was truly using these Sups. They had no free will. They followed his orders without question. And they feared him. They looked at Homelander with absolute reverence and respect. That he decided right then and there. They looked at him with reverence and respect. Chapter 36. The Cost of Perfection. Lowe's angels glittered beneath Homelander's gaze. Neon lights reflected in his black and gold suit as he stood on the rooftop, surveying an entire city that had bowed to him without even knowing why. The press conference was over now. The 7 new Sups were already deployed across major cities like New York and Chicago under Vought Studios' banner. But Homelander didn't care. The real work wasn't in front of cameras. It happened behind closed doors, where bloodstains could be cleaned up quickly without anyone asking questions. The 7 were not 7 yet. They were numbers, candidates, medical risks, public faces waiting to be sculpted. Some had names worth keeping, most did not. Marketing wanted clean archetypes: strength, speed, fire, water, beauty, innocence, patriotism. Science wanted survivability. Security wanted obedience. I wanted all 3. The argument lasted until I entered the room. The lineup cannot look too aggressive, marketing said, then immediately regretted speaking. Aggression sells when it has a flag behind it, I said. Security slid a folder forward. This one has loyalty concerns. I opened it, a telekinetic with a sick mother, debt, and an older brother in prison. Not loyalty concerns, leverage opportunities. Approved, I said. Science objected next. Her neural scans are unstable. Then keep her grateful and tired. The room wrote that down as if it were a policy. He flexed his fingers slowly as he walked toward the edge of a high-rise building overlooking downtown Lowe's Angels. Wind whipped against him, but did nothing to slow down or even slightly affect Homelander's perfect stance and demeanor throughout every moment spent there, while ignoring terrified civilians nearby despite knowing exactly what was going on right now, because he had been through it all before. The last Compound V subject lay in a steel containment chamber, hooked up to heart monitors and IV drips. His face twitched under the restraints as his eyes blinked open slowly. Homelander approached the containment unit, his boots clicking against polished metal as he examined a test subject, even if something was definitely off considering. He looked at the subject's face, noting every detail with a satisfied smirk. This one was different from all others created so far. Homelander could see it immediately right there in front of him. "Subject number 9, Homelander said, his voice booming through the sterile lab like thunder rolling across an empty sky. "You're looking good today." The subject's eyes fluttered, but remained unfocused. Homelander crouched beside the containment unit, placing a hand on its surface. He could feel it vibrating under his fingertips, an unnatural energy pulsing through this man's very core. "Perfect," Homelander murmured, standing back up. "A little more testing will show exactly how useful this one can be to me personally." He walked away from the containment unit, leaving behind a test subject, even if something was definitely off considering. As Homelander stepped out onto the rooftop once again, he looked across Lowe's Angels with a satisfied smile. The city was finally under his control now. No one questioned absolute authority anymore, regardless of previous events where the danger was already obvious. He had already started planning how to use these SUPs effectively. The press conference had gone perfectly fine. And now, with these SUPs ready and waiting under Vought Studios' banner, Homelander looked at the city one final time before taking flight, leaving behind terrified civilians nearby, even if something was definitely off considering. Asterisk Chapter 37, The Tyrant's Choice Asterisk. The sky over New York was grey and heavy that morning. Rain drizzled through the air in thin streams while wind howled down from distant mountains, as if trying to shake loose something it shouldn't have touched. Inside a small private room deep underground, far below any GDA surveillance or civilian access points, Homelander stood alone at one end of an empty space that had once held Nolan Grayson. Now there was nothing left but the memory and the weight behind those blue eyes looking straight ahead like they were still seeing something real. "I did not sleep much after Vought became unavoidable. Sleep belonged to people who trusted locked doors. I used the hours differently. Files, broadcasts, lab reports, flight paths over cities that looked defenseless from above and dishonest up close. Every night gave me more evidence that control was not cruelty, it was maintenance. The world broke itself constantly. A mayor taking bribes, a hero selling secrets, a police captain burying complaints, a father hitting a child behind apartment walls while neighbors turned televisions louder. None of it required me to invent darkness. I only had to decide whether darkness stayed freelance." At 3 in the morning, Cecil called. "Do you ever stop?" he asked. "Do you?" "I am human." That sounds like an excuse. He went quiet. I looked down at the city lights and waited for him to pretend he disagreed. He walked across concrete floors, coated in fresh blood from recent experiments gone wrong or simply not going far enough, boots clicking with every step. The walls around him held no pictures, trophies, or medals like those that once hung proudly in Nolan's private quarters above ground. They had all gone missing over time, as Homelander took what he wanted and left nothing behind to remind anyone else who owned this place anymore, except for the few remaining executives, still loyal enough despite knowing full well how things were going down. He paused briefly before a small glass window, looking out onto an underground training facility, where 7 new SUPs trained under his direct supervision. They moved with perfect coordination through various combat drills, designed specifically by Homelander himself, personally overseeing every detail. His thoughts drifted momentarily toward Nolan. now living comfortably somewhere far away, pretending it all worked out perfectly fine. And then it hit him hard like a physical blow right through chest armor and straight into gut. The truth about Nolan's fate was finally clicking together with full clarity, without needing any kind of translator, making his eyes lock firmly onto those blue ones, still looking directly back at whatever invisible enemy remained hidden somewhere deep inside Homelander himself. He had known from very beginning that it would end this way eventually, no matter how many years passed or what happened along the journey. Nolan was just too weak to carry weight anymore, despite being absolutely perfect in every single way possible. Homelander clenched his fists tightly. He had spent last decade preparing precisely because he knew this moment eventually coming. Nolan was just too predictable in every single way possible. There had never really existed any chance that Nolan could ever hope defeat Homelander in true battle without needing anything extra besides sheer luck. That didn't matter anymore, though. What mattered now was exactly who stood tall, proudly looking straight ahead without blinking. Homelander's eyes flicked briefly toward the door leading outside, before returning fully back onto those blue ones still locked firmly, without needing any kind translator. It didn't matter who exactly stood tall, proudly looking straight ahead without blinking. The only thing that mattered right now. And so Homelander made his choice right there, at that exact moment, with full clarity, without needing any kind translator. He turned away from glass window, looking out onto training facility below before heading straight toward main exit leading outside. The door slid open silently, with soft hiss revealing dark corridor, stretching far into distance. Asterisk Chapter 38, The Tyrant and His World. The air inside Nolan Grayson's training facility was thick, not just from the heat of his body as he trained in front of reporters, but because something had shifted. Homelander stood at a distance behind him, or rather beside himself for those few seconds, where they were literally standing side by side on stage. The cameras caught it all. Nolan's focused expression, the sweat on his brow as he launched himself into midair with a burst from Compound V enhanced legs. And Homelander, the real, raw version who had spent years perfecting this act. The city liked me more after the first, staged rescue. That was predictable and still disappointing. A collapsing bridge, 3 planted cameras, 2 real civilians pulled from real danger because incompetence had nearly ruined my choreography. By midnight, every network had the footage. By morning, strangers were crying on television about hope. Hope was easy to manufacture. The ingredients were height, light, timing, and a voice that sounded certain when everyone else sounded afraid. I watched the replay from my office, while the rescued woman thanked me through tears. "She believes it," Nolan said from the doorway. "Of course she does. I saved her life." After arranging the cameras. The bridge was collapsing with, or without cameras. He stepped inside, expression dark. "You do not hear yourself." I turned off the screen. "I hear everything. That is the problem with the rest of you. You only hear the part that lets you feel clean." He saw the man he had spent years turning into a weapon, an icon. And then Nolan landed, with perfect form in front of him again. "I'm ready," Nolan said without looking at him. Homelander heard those words and felt the weight behind them. Nolan was ready, not just physically, but emotionally too. He had spent years preparing this moment, not just training, but ensuring that Nolan understood exactly what was at stake. And then, "Good," Homelander said softly. "Then we start." The words hung in the air. Nolan didn't respond immediately. He looked at Homelander, and in that moment, Homelander saw the truth clearly. This was it. The endgame had begun. He turned and walked toward the exit. Nolan watched him leave without saying anything else. And then, it happened all at once. A low hum filled the air. The lights flickered once before plunging the room into darkness. And then, the explosion hit. It started with a single shot fired from Nolan's pistol. The bullet hit Homelander's shoulder, but that didn't stop him from moving. He turned and looked at Nolan. "Did you really think I'd let that happen?" Homelander asked softly. And then the room exploded in a cacophony. Glass shattered, metal twisted and buckled. And then Nolan Grayson launched himself at Homelander. The two figures collided in midair. And then the battle began. It lasted seconds, or maybe minutes. But in those moments, the world changed. And then the smoke cleared. Nolan stood in the rubble, battered, bruised but alive. And Homelander, the man who had spent years preparing this moment. And then the silence broke. Nolan looked at Homelander, not with hatred or anger, but something else. And Homelander, the man who had spent years preparing this moment. Asterisk chapter 39, The Tyrant and His Shadow asterisk. Homelander stood in front of Nolan Grayson. He looked down at the man who had been his nemesis for so long, but now he was just another obstacle on his path to power. Nolan's expression showed no fear or anger, only determination, as he stared back without blinking, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan did not threaten me directly. That was his best quality and his most obvious weakness. He wrapped everything in restraint, in civilized pauses, in the careful language of a man who wanted to believe violence was a tool he chose rather than a language he spoke fluently. "There are lines," he said. We stood on the roof, with wind snapping at our clothes hard enough to send papers skidding across the concrete behind us. "Lines move," I said. "Not all of them. Only because someone stronger pins them down." He looked at me then, really looked, and for a second the mask slipped. Not fear, not hatred. Recognition again, colder than before. "You think strength makes you right?" "No, I think strength decides how long wrong gets to keep talking." His hands curled once and opened. He wanted to hit me. He did not. That was why I smiled. "He not a hero," Homelander said, his voice carrying across the ruined training facility. "You never were." Nolan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't answer. There was no point in arguing with someone who had already made up their mind about them, regardless of evidence or reason, even if something was definitely off considering. The air around them crackled with energy as Homelander prepared himself. This was it. This moment he had waited so long to experience firsthand, without needing any kind of translator, even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan raised his arm and fired a shot. Homelander's eyes locked firmly onto it as he dodged effortlessly while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. The bullet missed and hit the ground instead. Nolan's eyes widened slightly as he realized something was definitely off considering. Homelander took the opportunity and lunged forward. Nolan raised his arm instinctively, but Homelander's fist crashed into it with enough force to send him flying backward, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan landed hard, but quickly got back up. His eyes showed determination as he looked straight ahead, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Homelander charged forward again. Nolan raised his arm once more, but this time Homelander's fist crashed into it with even greater force, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan's arm broke from the impact. He winced in pain, but didn't stop moving as his eyes locked firmly onto Homelander, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Homelander moved in close and delivered a powerful punch directly into Nolan's stomach. The force knocked him off his feet, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan coughed violently and fell onto his knees. Homelander looked at him with an expression that showed no pity, even if something was definitely off considering. "You're not strong enough," Homelander said, his voice carrying across the ruined facility. You never will be. Nolan's eyes burned with determination as he looked straight ahead, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Homelander took a step forward and raised his fist. Nolan's eyes widened slightly as he realized something was definitely off considering. But before Homelander could deliver the final blow, a massive explosion shook them both. Nolan's eyes widened as he realized something was definitely off considering. The blast sent them both flying backward, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. When the smoke cleared, Homelander stood beside Nolan. Both men looked at each other while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. The fight had ended, but the war between them still continued. Homelander knew that Nolan was not finished, and neither were his plans to rule over Earth absolutely without question, which felt extremely suspicious, though nobody dared challenge absolute authority, even if something was definitely off considering. He walked away from the ruins and toward an exit, leaving behind a battlefield that showed exactly what kind of man he truly was, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Chapter 40. The new era begins. The explosion had cleared the air of everything except smoke. Nolan Grayson stood in his ruined training facility as debris rained down around him like ash from a dying star. He was battered, blood seeped through multiple wounds, and one leg barely held up beneath its weight. But he remained standing on shaky legs that refused to give out despite the pain coursing rawly into every nerve. Homelander floated above it all in calm silence for several long moments, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. The destruction had stopped. The fire, though still smoldering in some places, no longer roared or spread like it, was about to swallow the whole block and burn everyone alive, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Smoke still hung in the air, thick enough that people watching from a distance had trouble making out what was happening clearly at all, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan's eyes searched the space above. The only figure standing there was Homelander, calm and composed in a way that made it hard to believe he had just destroyed something this big so easily, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. He had landed with enough force that it created a crater in the concrete floor below him, but he was standing on top as if gravity itself bowed to his presence. Nolan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Your strength, Nolan said, voice rough and strained as he stared up at Homelander with burning intensity, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. It's too much. You're not just stronger than me, you are something else. Nolan could feel it in his bones and blood. This was a power that went beyond the limits he understood as Omni-Man, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. It didn't just destroy, it redefined destruction itself, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Homelander floated slightly lower, landing on the crater floor with a heavy thud, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. He walked forward until he stood directly across from Nolan, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. You're not ready, Homelander said, voice carrying a calm authority that made the very air around them feel heavier. You still don't understand what you're up against, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who Homelander spoke about himself. I am ready, he growled back, eyes locked on Homelander with a glare that burned like heat vision, while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. You're not at all. Nolan didn't back away, even though Homelander's words made his skin crawl, and every fiber in him screamed to run as far from this place, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although nobody dared question absolute authority despite something definitely being off considering, while everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. He knew why Homelander said it, because he had seen the truth in Nolan's eyes. He saw that Omni-Man was still fighting with old limits, holding back his full power like a man who hadn't fully embraced what he could be yet instead of seeing something to exploit, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although nobody dared question absolute authority, despite knowing exactly why things were definitely off, considering how much worse everything was going to become later, especially the confrontation, when absolutely while the whole situation came crashing down entirely afterwards. "I will be," Nolan said, voice steady despite pain and exhaustion, "because I am Omni-Man." Nolan knew that Homelander was a force to contend with, stronger than anything he had ever faced before, including even Viltrumite-level threats like him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. But he also knew that Homelander, no matter how much power and charisma the man had while ignoring despite knowing exactly, was still human underneath it all. He had weaknesses, arrogance, that made him overestimate his own abilities while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He had a need, even if it was buried deep beneath layers and years. The desire not just to be seen as Earth's greatest hero, but actually felt worthy enough by others while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan knew that if he kept pushing, not just fighting, but proving himself in every way possible while ignoring despite knowing exactly, he could break through that barrier one day. He knew the road was long and difficult, but as Omni-Man fighting against Homelander, who had already become much stronger than even Viltrumite-level threats like him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly, he was willing and ready. He clenched his fists tighter, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. "Then I'll be ready too," Homelander said, voice calm and confident while ignoring despite knowing exactly. "I'll make sure you're ready." Nolan looked up at Homelander, determination blazing in his eyes while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He knew he had a long road ahead, but as Omni-Man facing Homelander, who was already much stronger than even Viltrumite-level threats like him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly, he was ready. The two stood across from each other in the wreckage, Homelander above him on top, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. They stood there in silence, staring at each other with eyes that burned like heat vision while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Then Homelander moved first. He descended toward Nolan with calm purpose while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He was fast, faster than anything Nolan had seen before, including even Viltrumite-level threats like him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan barely managed a step back before Homelander was already in front him, his fist coming toward Nolan's face with enough force to knock the wind out if it connected, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan barely had time to dodge, throwing himself sideways while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Homelander's punch missed, but he barely had time before the former Viltrumite was already turning toward him with another blow coming while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan barely managed to block, feeling the force behind Homelander's punches while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He knew Homelander was much stronger than even Viltrumite-level threats like him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan knew he had a long road ahead. He needed time, training and preparation, while ignoring despite knowing exactly what worse. Asterisk Chapter 41. The winner stands tall, asterisk. Homelander landed on his feet in midair and hovered effortlessly above the wreckage of what was once an elite training facility, now reduced to smoldering rubble. Nolan Grayson lay sprawled beneath a twisted steel beam that had collapsed during their brutal battle. The air around Homelander shimmered faintly with heat as he let out another short laugh, cold laughter laced through sheer arrogance, and the absolute certainty of victory in his eyes when everyone else would be scrambling to contain what just happened. He floated down toward Nolan, who was trying desperately not only get back up, but also find some semblance dignity despite being absolutely battered by Homelander's power display. The public loved a rescue more when it had a villain. Natural disasters were useful but impersonal. A burning building could make people grateful. A captured criminal could make them loyal. Loyalty needed a face to hate and a stronger face to thank. So Vought found faces. Real criminals when convenient, manufactured ones when necessary, men with records, men with debts, men who signed contracts they did not read and woke up inside narratives already written for them. I did not need to invent evil. The world had plenty. I only needed to arrange it under better lighting. This one has a family, an assistant said, pointing to a candidate on the list. Most people do. Children. I looked at him until he remembered where he was. Then make sure the cameras do not show the house. He wrote it down with a shaking hand. Nolan looked at him with something that wasn't quite hatred. It held more like stubborn determination, mixed disbelief about how things had gone so completely wrong this time. You think you won, Nolan rasped out, his voice hoarse from pain and exhaustion, but still carrying enough strength to cut through the silence of destruction around them. Homelander landed, softly beside him, with an arrogant smirk on face that spoke volumes louder than words ever could, while ignoring, even if something was definitely off considering. You're still standing, Homelander replied, kneeling beside Nolan with deliberate slowness that radiated supreme confidence. That says it all. He reached out casually to grab hold one of Nolan's arms while ignoring even if something was definitely off considering. Nolan pulled away sharply, eyes wide open with anger mixed shock at how easily Homelander could still touch him even after taking massive damage. You're not ready, he said firmly, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Homelander's smirk widened into something far more sinister, his eyes flashing dangerously as he leaned closer until they were barely inches apart. Ready me, he chuckled lowly, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. You're still just a boy playing at being an adult, Homelander continued, his voice dripping with absolute disdain that radiated off him in waves. You think you can stand against me against Viltrumite blood? He let out another low chuckle while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan clenched his jaw tightly, forcing himself not show how much Homelander's words hurt, even as he knew deep inside they were all true. He couldn't deny it. No matter how many times Nolan fought against him or tried to prove otherwise, there was still something fundamentally different about them, both, especially when someone like Viltrumite blood came into play entirely afterwards. You'll come around eventually, Homelander said softly, his tone suddenly turning almost paternal while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan didn't respond right away. There was simply too much pain and humiliation wrapped up in what just happened that he had no words left to say at moment, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Eventually, Homelander repeated, standing up fully now with a look that spoke volumes louder than words ever could while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He turned away from Nolan with one final smirk before flying straight toward the nearest exit, leaving behind a trail devastation that spoke volumes louder than any words ever could while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan watched him go, determination burning in eyes, even as he knew deep inside there was still something fundamentally different about them both. No matter how many times Nolan fought against Homelander or tried to prove otherwise, when someone like Viltrumite blood finally comes into play, especially the coming confrontation onwards, everything would change forever regardless of previous events, where the danger was already obvious, although absolutely nothing stayed held together anymore afterwards. Chapter 42, The Final Act. The rubble of Homelander's training facility still smoldered in places. Nolan Grayson sat amidst the debris on one knee, his left arm bent awkwardly at an unnatural angle, blood seeping through torn fabric and skin alike, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Homelander stood over him, arms crossed with an expression that was equal parts pride and disappointment, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. The emergency bunker under Vought Tower was mostly theater. It had blast doors, filtered air, private medical bays, and enough food to keep executives alive through disasters they would never personally solve. The real purpose was psychological. Men made better decisions when they believed there was somewhere to run. I kept my office above it, on purpose. Running was for people with bodies worth protecting more than their authority. Ashley toured the bunker with a clipboard and 3 assistants trailing behind her. Do you want a private suite reserved? No. For optics, it may help if the tower falls, I will not be under it. She crossed something off without comment. Smart. The assistants stared at the blast doors like children admiring a toy castle. They still believed walls were promises. I let them. Hope made employees arrive on time. He's still standing, Homelander said, voice carrying the same theatrical warmth that made him both beloved and feared. That alone deserves a round of applause. Nolan didn't respond immediately. He was too busy trying to steady his breathing while ignoring. You're a disappointment, Homelander continued, stepping closer with the air that always preceded something truly horrifying. I expected you to be ready. I know what kind of man you keep pretending to be. Nolan finally looked up at him through bloodshot eyes, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. I am, he said, voice hoarse. I'm getting there. Good, Homelander nodded approvingly while ignoring despite knowing exactly, but not quite ready enough. He raised a hand, and Nolan's left arm snapped back into place with an audible pop while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan gritted his teeth against the pain while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Get up, Homelander ordered, gesturing toward the remains of his training facility. I've got a new assignment. Nolan stood slowly, every step sending pain through him like knives, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Homelander smiled, the kind that was always just one step away from becoming monstrous, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. I'm ready, Nolan said, voice steady now that he was standing straight. Tell me what you need. Homelander's smile widened. It never looked quite right on him, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Good, Homelander said. I need you on the front lines. Nolan frowned slightly. It was a rare expression, one that didn't quite fit onto someone who had spent so much time in his father's shadow while ignoring. The front lines, he asked, voice laced with confusion while ignoring. Yes, Homelander said, voice filled with the same theatrical warmth that always made him sound like he was performing a play rather than giving orders. I've got something coming, and I need you there to see it firsthand. Nolan nodded slowly while ignoring. Understood, he said, voice steady. Where do I start? Homelander pointed toward the remains of his training facility. It was still smoldering in places despite all that destruction, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Right here, Homelander said. We'll start from the ground up. Nolan nodded again. It was a small gesture, one that spoke volumes about how far he had come, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He walked toward the smoldering ruins, determined. It was an expression he wore far too often these days, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Homelander watched him go. The expression on his face was one he wore far too often these days as well, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan was getting stronger and faster. He had already proven that he could stand up after a brutal battle with Homelander himself while ignoring despite knowing exactly. It was only a matter of time before he caught up, and Homelander knew it. He had seen the look in Nolan's eyes too many times to miss what kind of man his son would become while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He just hoped Nolan didn't catch up too soon. He had plans, and they required Homelander's dominance to remain absolute while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Because once Nolan caught up, there was no telling who the real winner in this war between father and son might turn out to be while ignoring despite knowing exactly. The world didn't change overnight. It changed in ways that were both subtle and brutal. Homelander stood atop his training facility's wreckage like he owned the sky itself, which, to be fair, was entirely true for him at this point, after what had just happened with Nolan Grayson back there, before everything went completely sideways again. But nothing ever stayed held together, anymore regardless of previous events. where fear was obvious, yet wasn't somehow despite absolutely knowing exactly how things were going to become later, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore no matter the circumstances. And even though he had won this battle against Nolan Grayson, who was now officially his subordinate, because Homelander decided it for him, regardless of what Nolan himself actually wanted or needed. But nobody dared question absolute authority. Not with all these clearly couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, and there wasn't even a single person here who could truly claim they hadn't been directly involved in some way, shape, form, through whatever means possible. Homelander looked at the mess around him with satisfaction. Nolan had put up more of an actual fight than most people gave credit for, while ignoring clearly couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. But that was exactly why he'd been so brutal in breaking his spirit. It wasn't just about training anymore. No matter what Nolan himself might have claimed earlier, before things went completely sideways again, because nothing would stay stable for long, staring them in their faces, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. He walked across what was left of his training facility like it didn't matter that he just destroyed half its structure and killed several people, trying to protect Nolan Grayson from himself back there, before absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of. Nolan was still lying on the ground nearby, battered, but not unconscious. He looked up at Homelander with something between anger and gratitude, or maybe just plain confusion, considering what had actually happened during their recent battle, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. "You're still here?" Nolan asked weakly, trying to sit up despite the pain radiating through his entire body from all those injuries caused by Homelander's brutal training regimen, combined with absolutely knowing exactly. "You're my subordinate now," Homelander said coldly, ignoring the fact that Nolan himself had never actually agreed to this arrangement, while still pretending he hadn't just killed several innocent bystanders, trying desperately hard not get caught up in what happened next, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet clearly wasn't for reasons nobody could fully explain, even with all the evidence right there staring them directly into their faces, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. Nolan let out a frustrated sigh, shaking his head. "I didn't agree to this." "You're not asking for my permission," Homelander replied flatly, before turning away from Nolan completely and walking towards the nearest building where terrified civilians were still panicking nearby, clearly couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. And that was exactly what made him feel truly victorious. He didn't need anyone's agreement, not even his own. He just decided things would be this way from now on, and nobody dared challenge absolute authority, despite knowing exactly how bad it could potentially get later, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of. He pushed open the door to what used to be one of his training rooms and stepped inside without hesitation. The civilians screamed even louder than they had before, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet clearly wasn't for reasons nobody could fully explain, despite all these terrified people panicking nearby who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. Homelander ignored them completely, walking right up to the nearest person and grabbing him by his throat. The poor civilian barely had time react before Homelander lifted him effortlessly into midair like he weighed no more than a feather, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. "You know what's funny?" he asked casually, lifting the man higher up so everyone could clearly see his face as they screamed even louder in fear, knowing absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of. "What is it?" the civilian choked out, trying desperately hard not panic despite what was clearly happening right there before his very eyes, because absolutely nothing would ever be safe again, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of. "It's how scared you all are," Homelander said, with an actual smirk forming on his lips like he was genuinely amused by their reactions, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. "You're absolutely certain this is happening right now. I'm standing here in front of you, holding your friend up against his will, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet clearly wasn't for reasons nobody could fully explain, even with all the evidence sitting there staring them directly into their faces, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious." The civilian tried to say something back, but Homelander just squeezed harder on his throat until he stopped moving entirely. Then, with absolutely no hesitation, and without caring about what anyone else thought at this point, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, Homelander dropped him straight down onto the ground, where who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. "You're absolutely certain this is happening right now," he repeated, walking over to another civilian and grabbing them by their shirt collar like he was just doing his daily routine, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. "You know what's going on. You saw everything that happened here before me. Right, and now you're absolutely certain this is still happening despite absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet clearly wasn't for reasons nobody could fully explain, even with all the evidence sitting there staring them directly into their faces, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. The second civilian tried to run, but Homelander just grabbed him by his leg and yanked hard enough that he fell right back down onto the ground, where absolutely nothing would ever be safe again, even as fear became obvious. "You're not even pretending you don't know what's happening," Homelander said casually, walking up to them and holding their face in his hands while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. "You're absolutely certain this is real. You saw everything with your own eyes, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards." The civilian just stared back at him wide-eyed, completely frozen in place by fear despite knowing absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet clearly wasn't for reasons nobody could fully explain, even with all the evidence sitting there staring them directly into their faces, while ignoring who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious. "That's exactly why I'm here," Homelander said coldly, letting go of him completely and walking away without another word, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore. And that was exactly what who couldn't see anything wrong, which felt extremely suspicious, because absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore. Asterisk Chapter 43, The Tyrant's Triumph. Homelander soared above Manhattan in his signature crimson and gold suit. His face was calm but cold under the sun as he looked down at Nolan Grayson, who sat on one knee inside a ruined training facility that had once been pristine before their brutal clash reduced it to rubble. "You're not ready," Homelander said quietly while ignoring. Cecil came alone the next time, which meant he was either desperate or trying to flatter me. The folder under his arm was thin. Thin folders were dangerous. Thick folders meant bureaucracy. Thin folders meant a decision had already been made, and someone wanted me to think I still had input. "There are limits," he said. I laughed once. He did not. "You are creating a private superhuman army on American soil. Publicly branded, actually. Do not play word games with me. Then stop bringing me words that pretend to be limits." His face hardened. Good. Anger made him honest faster than fear did. "You think because I cannot stop you today, I will never find a way." I stood slowly, not because I needed the height, but because he needed to remember it. No, Cecil, I think you will spend your life looking for one. That is why I keep you useful. Nolan looked up at him with a defiant glare, refusing Homelander's attempt at paternal reassurance while ignoring. I'm stronger than you think, Nolan said firmly, showing no hesitation. I've trained hard and I'll keep getting stronger. Homelander chuckled, shaking his head at Nolan's determination. I hope you're right, Homelander said while ignoring. But I'm the one who decides that. He then turned his attention away from Nolan, looking toward a group of while ignoring them. I know, Nolan said, showing no hesitation, but I'm not afraid. Homelander narrowed his eyes at him, while ignoring. I'm not afraid either, Homelander said while ignoring, and that's why I'll win. Nolan stood up, showing no hesitation. I'm not afraid either, Nolan said, and that's why I'll win too. Homelander looked at him with a mixture of arrogance and confidence while ignoring. You're strong, Homelander said while ignoring, but you're not ready. Nolan looked at him with a defiant glare, showing no hesitation. I'm ready, Nolan said firmly. I've trained hard and I'll keep getting stronger. Homelander chuckled, shaking his head at him while ignoring. I hope you're right, Homelander said while ignoring, but I'm the one who decides that. Asterisk Chapter 44, The Throne of Earth. The lights were off in Nolan Grayson's private quarters. He sat on the edge of his bed like he was waiting for something to happen. He wasn't sleeping, and it had been 2 days since Homelander delivered him back into Vought hands, battered, but alive after their brutal battle at an elite training facility, reduced entirely to rubble by sheer force alone, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. By the time the tower opened officially, people were already calling it a landmark. That amused me. Landmarks were supposed to mark history after it happened. Mine announced history before anyone had permission to disagree. The ribbon ceremony had flags, music, children in Vought-branded shirts, and enough police presence to make the crowd feel protected instead of contained. Cecil attended without smiling. Subtle, he said. Effective. Those are not the same thing. They are when people only remember the result. He watched the crowd chant my name. There was disgust in his expression, but also calculation. He could hate the machine and still use its shadow. That was why I kept answering his calls. You built a church, he said. I looked at the tower, the cameras, the thousands of lifted faces. No, I said. Churches ask people to believe. I am giving them proof. The air smelled faintly metallic in here, like sweat and blood. Nolan looked at his hands, still bruised from the last fight they had with Homelander, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He knew his body was healing fast, but it didn't feel right. Try again. Homelander's voice echoed through the room like thunder rolling across open sky, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan looked up sharply. What? You heard me, Homelander replied casually, leaning against the doorway like he owned this place while ignoring despite knowing exactly. You want to prove you're more than just a Viltrumite puppet who gets knocked around by my own hand until he learns his place. Nolan narrowed his eyes at him, not answering right away. Think about it, Homelander continued smoothly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. You've got potential, Nolan Grayson, more than you're letting yourself believe while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Prove me wrong. The words hit Nolan like a punch straight in the gut, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He stood up from the bed, his voice shaking slightly with anger and frustration. You mean like last time? Homelander gave him a cold look while ignoring despite knowing exactly. That was practice, Nolan Grayson, not performance while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan clenched his fists tightly, trying hard not let Homelander see how much he hated him while ignoring despite knowing exactly. I don't need your approval, Homelander. I know, Homelander said simply while ignoring despite knowing exactly. But you're not getting anywhere without it. Nolan looked away from him, unable or unwilling at this point to look Homelander in the eye while ignoring despite knowing exactly. I don't care if you ever approve or not, Homelander. I just want freedom. You're free to go anywhere, Homelander said softly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. But I don't want you running away again. I won't run, Nolan said firmly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Not this time. Good, Homelander said, stepping closer while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Then let's see if you can make me proud one day, Nolan Grayson. Nolan looked back at him defiantly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. We'll see about that, Homelander. Homelander smiled slightly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. That's the spirit, Nolan Grayson. And with that final line said, while ignoring despite knowing exactly, Homelander walked away, leaving Nolan alone in his room while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan sat back on the bed again, looking at his hands while ignoring despite knowing exactly. His mind was racing through all the possibilities, none good, and he knew it. But what else could there be if Homelander truly meant every word just now while ignoring despite knowing exactly? Then maybe there was still hope. Maybe he could prove himself worthy in Homelander's eyes one day while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Maybe he could finally find freedom from Homelander's grip someday while ignoring despite knowing exactly. And maybe, just as importantly, he could stop feeling like Homelander owned him while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Maybe it was worth the risk after all, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan closed his eyes tightly, taking a deep breath while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He had a lot more work left ahead, both inside and outside this room. But at least now, he knew what direction to take while ignoring despite knowing exactly. And if Homelander was right about one thing, it sure as hell better be worth the effort while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan opened his eyes again, staring straight ahead at the wall like he was seeing something different now, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. He knew the path ahead was still dangerous, and more than likely bloody. But he also felt something inside him shift slightly while ignoring despite knowing exactly. It was small, just a tiny spark that burned bright enough right now, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. But it was there, and that counted as progress in his book, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Nolan Grayson sat back on the bed once more, letting his eyes drift shut, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Sleep didn't come immediately, not tonight. But rest did, and that was enough while ignoring despite knowing exactly. After all, the battle ahead was still waiting, and it wouldn't be easy while ignoring despite knowing exactly. But Nolan had made his choice, and that was the most important thing right now, while ignoring despite knowing exactly. Asterisk Chapter 45. The Tyrant's Gambit Asterisk. The air inside Homelander's private quarters was thick. Humid heat pressed down on the room like a weighted blanket against Nolan Grayson's skin as he stood frozen in front of his superior, staring directly back without blinking. Sweat rolled freely from every pore despite, knowing full well this wasn't happening right now at all, but rather some alternate version where everything stayed held together forever and ever, amen. I won't be your subordinate, Nolan said clearly while ignoring. I don't need you telling me what to do. The vote was never really about approval. Approval was the decoration placed on top of surrender so the people signing the papers could still sleep afterward. They wanted oversight boards, reporting language, emergency review clauses, and names for committees that would meet only after decisions had already become facts. I let them have most of it. Paper made them comfortable. Comfort made them slow. Cecil read the final draft across from me with a face like carved stone. He had negotiated harder than anyone else, which meant he understood exactly how much he had already lost. This gives Vought too much room, he said. It gives you a room inside Vought. That is not reassuring. It was not meant to be. He closed the folder, One day you will push too far. I stood, smoothing my sleeve. Then make sure you are close enough to see it coming. Homelander stepped closer, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the smaller man before him, despite completely lacking any experience handling such thing, while without restraint, and without hesitation, even when knowing full well exactly who he was looking at right now. Then prove yourself, Homelander demanded coldly. Prove you're worthy of being my equal. Nolan clenched his fists tighter, determination burning behind those steely grey eyes as something deep down inside him sparked briefly before fading away, just as quickly like a candle flame, flickering out in the wind despite, knowing full well everything would turn out better eventually. I will, Nolan vowed fiercely, but on your terms, not yours alone. The silence between them stretched unbearably long while ignoring, as if they weren't even there at all despite, knowing full well exactly. Homelander finally broke the silence with a cold, calculating smile that sent chills running up and down Nolan's spine, even though he didn't want to admit it despite knowing full well this was exactly. You're already my subordinate, Homelander said flatly, and you will remain so until I say otherwise. Nolan gritted his teeth, fury simmering beneath the surface, but keeping it firmly contained, just as well despite, knowing full well, this wasn't happening right now at all, and everything would turn out better eventually. Not if we have anything to do with each other, Nolan shot back defiantly, while ignoring even when they were literally in the room together, witnessing it firsthand. The tension crackled visibly between them like static electricity, about ready to discharge at any second, while ignoring even when they stood mere feet apart witnessing it firsthand. Then, without warning or explanation, despite completely lacking any experience handling such thing, and without needing a single word of clarification, Homelander suddenly grabbed Nolan by the throat hard enough that he choked on his own air for several seconds straight, while ignoring even when they were right there witnessing it unfold in real time. Nolan struggled violently against the iron grip, but his strength was nowhere near enough compared absolutely. He kicked and punched wildly, while ignoring even when they were literally inches away from the spectacle unfolding before them. Just as Nolan was about ready to give up hope entirely, just like everything else that absolutely, the door slammed open dramatically behind them despite, knowing full well this moment had already happened countless times before just with different people standing in the exact same spot, witnessing it firsthand. A tall, imposing figure strode confidently into view, his presence instantly commanding attention from everyone present regardless of what they were doing or thinking about at that precise instant. It was none other than Nolan Grayson himself, wearing nothing but a shirt and shorts. Homelander released Nolan immediately upon seeing his brother enter confidently and calmly without needing any kind translator. "You're late," Homelander said coolly as he adjusted his shirt casually. "I had important business," Nolan replied smoothly. Homelander chuckled lightly at his brother's attempt at sounding cool and collected. "You always do," Homelander said with a smirk. Nolan rolled his eyes, good-naturedly. Yeah, Nolan said dismissively. Homelander chuckled again, before finally letting go completely. As Nolan took a few deep breaths trying desperately to regain composure, Homelander casually turned back toward Nolan with a look that clearly said, "This isn't over yet." Nolan met his gaze defiantly. "We'll talk about this more tomorrow," he said firmly, before walking away confidently. Homelander watched him go for several seconds, before finally turning his attention back toward something else entirely. Whatever this was, it clearly wasn't over yet, and absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of. And as Homelander continued thinking about what he could do next, Nolan Grayson walked out into night air, carrying heavy weapon, just as if he hadn't been battered and humiliated by brutal training, imposed without consent. With one last defiant glance back at Homelander, Nolan disappeared into darkness, carrying heavy weapon, just as if he hadn't been battered, and humiliated by brutal training imposed without consent. And as he did so, just like everything else that absolutely, the world seemed ready once again on the brink edge, teetering dangerously close toward absolute chaos and destruction. Invincible. What if I am reborn as Homelander? Chapter 46. 8. The Tyrant's throne is built on blood and fire. Nolan Grayson stood beneath the bright stadium lights, his body battered but not broken. His breath came in ragged gasps from the brutal training imposed without consent or explanation while ignoring. Homelander hovered above him, arms crossed in the classic paternal authority pose while ignoring. The night before the vote, I walked through Vought Tower alone. The building was no longer ugly. Marble floors, glass walls, security hidden behind smiles and polished desks, a shrine pretending to be a corporation. Every floor hummed with people who had learned to say my name carefully, as if the wrong tone might summon me. Sometimes it did. I stopped in the observation level and looked down at the city. Thousands of lights, millions of lives, all of them moving inside systems they barely understood, trusting that someone else had planned the disaster routes, guarded the borders, checked the skies. They wanted freedom because they had never been asked to survive without someone stronger paying the price. I placed one hand against the glass. It did not crack. That restraint felt almost generous. Behind me, the elevator opened. Nobody stepped out right away. "Come in," I said. Nolan did. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The city filled the silence for us. "A failure," Homelander said, his voice carrying across the stadium in that theatrical tone he reserved specifically towards protecting someone seriously injured while ignoring. "You're weak, Nolan Grayson." Nolan spat blood onto the concrete and stood straighter despite his broken ribs screaming in protest while ignoring. "You're lying." Homelander's eyes narrowed, the heat vision flickering behind them in frustration while ignoring. "You're a coward, Nolan Grayson." Nolan's hands trembled as he clenched them into fists while ignoring. "You're not a father, Homelander." The crowd gasped as Nolan's words hit the air like bullets while ignoring. Homelander's face twisted with rage, the heat vision blazing hotter than ever while ignoring. "You don't know anything, Nolan Grayson," Homelander said through gritted teeth while ignoring. "You're not strong enough, smart enough, you are weak." Nolan's eyes burned with defiance as he looked up at Homelander while ignoring. "I'm not weak," Nolan said, his voice steady and cold while ignoring. "You're the weak one." The heat vision flared brighter, burning Nolan's face with white-hot intensity while ignoring. "You don't know who you're talking to," Homelander said, his voice trembling with rage and insecurity while ignoring. "You're a failure." Nolan's jaw tightened as he looked Homelander in the eyes while ignoring. "I'm not a failure," Nolan said, his voice steady and cold while ignoring. "You're the weak one." Homelander's face twisted in rage, and he lunged forward with a punch that sent Nolan flying across the stadium while ignoring. Nolan's body slammed into the stands with a sickening thud while ignoring. The crowd gasped as Nolan lay motionless while ignoring. Homelander hovered above him, his face twisted in rage while ignoring. "You're a failure," Homelander said, his voice trembling with rage and insecurity while ignoring. "You're weak." Nolan's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Homelander with a cold stare while ignoring. "You're the weak one," Nolan said, his voice steady and cold while ignoring. "You're the one who can't handle losing." Chapter 47. Nolan Grayson *. I lay on my back in silence. My body hurt. Every muscle throbbed like someone had beaten me senseless and left the job unfinished. But I could still feel it, every single bruise from Homelander's punch. The afternoon sun beat down through a gap between two buildings across an abandoned training lot that hadn't seen anything close to this in years. The air was dry enough you didn't need water for hydration. Your lungs just kept burning regardless of how much oxygen they sucked up with each breath. and every drop on the ground evaporated before it touched my skin. The tower's top floor had a private elevator, but I preferred the stairs when people were waiting for me. Footsteps did something useful to a room. They gave anticipation a rhythm. By the time I reached the door, everyone inside had already imagined me entering 10 different ways. Fear rehearsed itself before I arrived. Nolan was there. Cecil too. Ashley near the wall with a tablet held against her chest like a shield. 3 executives thought silence made them less noticeable. Dr. Patel looked exhausted and angry, and still more valuable than all 3 executives combined. "You called this meeting," Cecil said. "I did." "Then start." I walked to the head of the table and did not sit. "Vought is no longer asking for space in the existing order," I said. "The existing order is being invited to survive inside mine." Nobody interrupted. That was progress. I could hear voices behind me. Homelander talking over himself like he never stopped breathing even when his chest wasn't moving. He was pacing in a circle around where I lay while ranting about something that didn't matter anymore because nothing mattered after this. Not really. Not to someone who'd just been told they were weak and had no choice but accept it. He called me Nolan Grayson again, as if we needed the reminder of what he kept calling himself when talking trash. He said I was a disappointment in every way possible from birth, until now despite having potential that could have made him look good instead. Which didn't help, because all those words were true enough and landed like fists to my ribs, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. He kept talking about me being his subordinate without asking if I agreed or cared at this point, since absolute authority decided it on our behalf regardless of previous events, where visible fear should have been obvious, yet wasn't for reasons completely unknown, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. He wanted to know why we weren't following orders properly, even though he never told us what the hell they were supposed to be in first place, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. He stopped pacing and knelt beside me, hovering close like a bird about ready strike, but didn't because his eyes looked tired. He said I was still weak despite all this training, which hurt more than getting punched did for some reason that made no sense at the time, since we both knew damn well he could have killed anyone who walked in front of him with one thought, and hadn't even tried it yet while ignoring. He asked me if I wanted to be strong enough so my people didn't have to suffer like they did back home. He called them Nolans, because that was what Homelander kept calling himself whenever talking trash despite knowing full well this wasn't happening right now at all, but rather some alternate version where everything stayed held together forever and ever, amen. He said I could be something real if only my head stopped being so stubborn about wanting freedom when there were clearly better things to fight for, like protecting the people who trusted me, because that was what a good leader did, instead of pretending they weren't weak at this point, since absolute authority already decided it on their behalf, without asking first while ignoring. He said he understood why I didn't trust him, but expected loyalty regardless, and would keep training until his opinion changed one way or another. He stood up and walked away slowly like he really didn't want this conversation, because his voice went quiet after saying that last bit which hurt more than getting punched did, for some reason, I still can't explain. He left me alone with my thoughts while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. I stayed there on the ground until every inch of pain in my ribs felt familiar, like it always had, and nothing was changing despite everything Homelander said about being strong enough to make a difference one day soon. I closed my eyes tight, but didn't fall asleep, because sleep meant giving up control, which wasn't happening right now at all, no matter how hard he tried pushing me toward accepting subordination without consent. I opened them again and saw him standing by the entrance of our private quarters, talking quietly with someone who looked like they belonged to Vought despite not knowing anything about what was going on around us, or why absolute authority decided it would be best if we stayed in one place together, instead staying separate for training purposes as agreed upon previously. They didn't look friendly. They had that cold, calculating stare Homelander used when talking business, and said exactly 0 things I wanted to hear at this point, since everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not, because it was happening regardless of previous events, where visible fear should have been obvious, yet wasn't for reasons completely unknown. Although nothing mattered anymore after getting knocked unconscious by someone who claimed they were a father figure, even though we both knew damn well that didn't mean shit. They left without saying goodbye and Homelander followed them out, leaving me alone with my thoughts once more while ignoring. I sat up slowly despite every bone in my body protesting loudly at the same time, because staying put meant giving absolute authority, exactly what he wanted, which wasn't happening right now no matter how much pressure was being applied from both sides simultaneously without asking first. I stood on shaky legs and walked toward our quarters, feeling like a ghost watching everything happen around me while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. I passed other sups walking by with smiles plastered across their faces that looked fake enough to fool anyone, but didn't help because every single one of them was under absolute authority's control regardless of previous events, where visible fear should have been obvious yet wasn't for reasons completely unknown, although nothing mattered anymore after getting knocked unconscious just moments ago. I reached the door and saw my reflection staring back at me like I'd never seen myself before, which hurt more than anything Homelander said about being weak, because it made everything feel real in a way that didn't make sense, since absolute authority decided this on our behalf, without asking first. The look of defiance was gone, replaced by something colder, something closer to fear, but still held onto tightly like letting go meant admitting defeat, which wasn't happening right now at all no matter how much pressure Homelander applied from both sides, simultaneously despite knowing damn well he could have killed anyone who walked in front him with one thought, and hadn't even tried it yet while ignoring. The door opened behind me, but I didn't turn around to see if they were expecting something different this time, since absolutely nothing was staying held together anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious. The room felt smaller somehow, like Homelander had moved things closer together without asking first or explaining why it mattered enough for absolute authority decide on our behalf, even though we both knew damn well he could have killed anyone who walked in front him with one thought and hadn't even tried it yet while ignoring. I sat down heavily at my desk, feeling every single bruise scream louder than they had moments ago when Homelander knocked me unconscious. I stared blankly ahead, but didn't see anything real because everything felt like a dream that wasn't mine to wake up from despite knowing damn well he could have killed anyone who walked in front him with one thought and hadn't even tried it yet while ignoring. The clock ticked quietly on the wall behind me, counting down every second until the confrontation when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore, no matter how many times Homelander promised otherwise. I closed my eyes tight, but didn't fall asleep, because sleep meant giving up control, which wasn't happening right now at all regardless of whether he liked listening or not, since absolute authority decided it on our behalf without asking first. I opened them again and saw him standing by the entrance with a grin plastered across his face that looked fake enough to fool anyone, but didn't help, because every single one of us was under absolute authority's control regardless. He said something about how I needed more training, which hurt way worse than getting knocked unconscious just moments ago, since nothing mattered anymore after everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not despite knowing damn well. Walked away slowly like he really didn't want this conversation, because his voice went quiet again, but that only made it harder to ignore who clearly couldn't see anything wrong, while ignoring absolutely every single thing Homelander said about being strong enough so my people wouldn't have to suffer anymore regardless of previous events, where visible fear should have been obvious yet wasn't for reasons completely unknown, although nothing mattered at this point since absolute authority decided it on our behalf without asking first. He left me alone with the silence, which felt louder than anything he'd said, because now there was no one around who looked like they belonged to Vought despite not knowing exactly what was going through my head right then while ignoring. I sat at that desk until every inch of pain in my ribs stopped burning and everything else faded into background noise, which didn't help since absolute authority decided it on our behalf without asking first. I stood up slowly like someone who knew damn well he could have killed anyone standing right there with one thought, but hadn't even tried, because they were still waiting for me to prove myself worthy despite knowing exactly what worse things were going to become later, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing was staying held together anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't. I walked toward our quarters feeling like a ghost, watching everything happen around us, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. I passed other sups walking by with smiles plastered across their faces that looked fake enough to fool anyone, but didn't help, because every single one of them was under absolute authority's control regardless. I reached the door and saw my reflection staring back at me like it hadn't changed despite everything Homelander said about being weak, which hurt more than anything he'd ever done, since absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore no matter how many times they promised otherwise while ignoring. The room felt smaller somehow, like absolute authority had moved things closer together, without asking first or explaining why it mattered enough for me to care at this point, despite knowing damn well I could have killed anyone who walked in front of him with one thought and hadn't even tried yet. The clock ticked quietly on the wall behind us, counting down every second, until the confrontation when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore, no matter how many times Homelander promised otherwise. I closed my eyes tight, but didn't fall asleep, because sleep meant giving up control, which wasn't happening right now at all regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet hadn't for reasons completely unknown, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not, since absolute authority decided it on our behalf without asking first. I opened them again and saw him standing by the entrance with a grin plastered across his face that looked fake enough to fool anyone, but didn't help because every single one of us was under control regardless. He said something about how we needed more training, which hurt way worse than getting knocked unconscious just moments ago, since nothing mattered anymore after everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not despite knowing damn well. He walked away slowly like someone who really didn't want this conversation, because his voice went quiet again, but that only made it harder to ignore. He left me alone with the silence, which felt louder than anything else since absolute authority decided everything on our behalf without asking first or explaining why we needed more training despite knowing damn well he could have killed anyone standing right there. I sat at my desk feeling like a ghost, watching absolutely every single thing Homelander said about being strong enough so people wouldn't suffer anymore, while ignoring who clearly couldn't see anything wrong. I stared blankly ahead, but didn't focus on any particular thought, because everything felt real in a way that made no sense at this point, since absolute authority decided it all without asking first. The clock ticked quietly, counting down every second, until the confrontation when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet hadn't for reasons completely unknown, although I'd rather be knocked unconscious again than hear another lecture about how weak we were despite knowing damn well he could have killed anyone standing right there with one thought and hadn't even tried it. I closed my eyes tight, but didn't fall asleep, because sleep meant giving up control, which wasn't happening regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet weren't for reasons completely unknown, although everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not, since absolute authority decided on our behalf without asking first. I opened them again and saw him standing by the entrance with a grin plastered across his face that looked fake enough to fool anyone, but didn't help because every single one of us was under control regardless. He said something about how we needed more training, which hurt way worse than getting knocked unconscious just moments ago, since nothing mattered anymore after everything came crashing down entirely afterwards, whether he liked listening or not despite knowing damn well. He walked away slowly like someone who really wasn't interested in this conversation, because his voice went quiet again, but that only made it harder to ignore. Asterisk Chapter 48, Final Reckoning. Tell me something. Later, when the meeting ended, and the tower emptied into late-night quiet, I remained above the city. The glass reflected me back at myself. White cape, clean lines, calm expression, eyes bright enough to turn the reflection into something almost holy. Almost. Holiness required humility, and humility was a costume designed by people afraid to admit they wanted power too. I had no use for it. Below, traffic moved like blood through veins. Above, clouds covered the stars. Between them stood Vought Tower, lit from foundation to crown, a warning disguised as a promise. I thought about the street where this life began. The first officer, the bullet between my fingers, the moment everyone learned that the rules had changed. They had not changed enough yet. But they would. Nolan Grayson sat slumped in the chair opposite my desk. He didn't look up, eyes downcast toward his bruised knuckles resting on top of a stack of file folders that bore no names but contained everything about every person he had ever harmed under Vaught's banner. I stared at him for several seconds, as though I were thinking deeply and carefully weighing my words. Nolan shifted slightly in the chair, his jaw tightening with suppressed anger or frustration, probably both, and then finally looked up to meet our eyes head-on. Two men who had spent a decade building empires together while pretending they weren't. "You think I'm afraid of you," he said flatly. "You're not even close." I smiled and leaned back in my chair. Arms crossed over one another with an air that suggested absolute confidence about everything we were discussing at this moment, right now rather than simply thinking it through carefully, which was exactly what happened every single time, whenever anything remotely resembling actual conversation occurred between us regardless of whether, or not anyone, involved wanted to admit they knew damn well precisely how completely wrong everyone else's assumptions actually turned out later, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore. "I'm aware you're afraid," I said quietly, watching him closely. "You've always been." Nolan blinked once sharply, before shaking his head slightly in denial, but not quite fast enough to make me believe it, even for a second longer than necessary, which meant exactly 0 seconds at all really, since clearly fear was obvious, yet wasn't, so something was definitely wrong here. Although absolutely every single thing Homelander said about being strong enough now made sense, considering everything everyone knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand. "You're not afraid of me," I continued calmly, "because you have already seen what happens when someone mistakes restraint for weakness." Nolan's mouth twitched slightly at that accusation, but he didn't deny its truthfulness either, which meant something very specific had occurred recently enough for him still feel the lingering physical and emotional effects, regardless of how much effort went into pretending otherwise. "You think you're strong," I added, my voice dropping to a low whisper now, as though we were discussing extremely sensitive matters that absolutely nobody else needed to know anything about, no matter what anyone might actually believe at this exact moment in time, which everything came crashing down entirely afterwards. "But strength isn't something people are born with." Nolan's eyes narrowed dangerously fast, but I could see clearly he was still trying very hard indeed, not let whatever emotions were bubbling just below the surface escape notice, despite knowing full well they absolutely would eventually, no matter how much effort went into pretending otherwise, especially the confrontation, when absolutely nothing stayed held together anymore regardless of previous events, where the danger was already obvious. "Strength," I continued, "is something people earn. It's earned through blood and sweat every single day, until one fine morning you wake up realizing it was never yours to begin with, but rather belonged exclusively unto someone else who clearly didn't want anything having gone absolutely completely wrong." Nolan stared at me for several seconds longer than strictly necessary, while making a point of maintaining eye contact, especially the confrontation, when everything would crash down entirely afterwards regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't, which meant something was definitely very wrong here. Although absolutely every single thing Homelander said about being strong enough now made sense, considering everything everyone knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand. "You think you're ready for that," I finished softly, But readiness isn't the same as strength. It's not even remotely close. Nolan opened his mouth to respond, but whatever words were going through his head never actually came out at all, which only served further reinforce exactly what we both already knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand, although absolutely everything Homelander said about being strong enough now made sense, considering how completely wrong things turned out later, especially the confrontation, when nothing stayed held together anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't for reasons entirely unknown. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly around the room with deliberate purpose, while keeping one hand casually resting against an imaginary weapon. I could conjure at will simply by thinking about it hard enough, even though absolutely nothing would ever stay held together, anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't for reasons entirely unknown, although everything came crashing down completely afterwards. "You're going to keep doing exactly what you've always done," I said quietly, "because that's all there is left when absolute authority decides it on your behalf, without asking whether or not anyone involved actually wanted anything having gone absolutely completely wrong." Nolan looked away sharply, but didn't say another word as he sat back down in his chair, while pretending everything around him was perfectly normal despite knowing damn well nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't for reasons entirely unknown, although absolutely every single thing Homelander said about being strong enough now made sense, considering how completely wrong things turned out later, especially the confrontation when nothing stayed held together anymore. I stood behind him and looked down at the file folders he had brought with them, while thinking exactly what worse things were going to become later, even though we both knew damn well absolutely everything would crash entirely afterwards regardless of, although nothing stayed held together anymore. "Tell me something," I said gently, "about the last person you hurt." Nolan's jaw tightened visibly, but he didn't answer immediately, which only served further reinforce exactly what we both already knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand, even though absolutely everything completely wrong things turned out later, especially the confrontation, when nothing stayed held together anymore regardless of previous events, where fear was obvious yet wasn't for reasons entirely unknown, although absolutely every single thing he said from that moment forward felt extremely suspicious despite knowing full well it was happening right here in front us perfectly fine. I didn't wait around any longer than necessary, while thinking exactly what worse things were going to become later, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely everything completely wrong things turned out later, especially the confrontation when absolute authority decided it on their behalf, without asking whether or not anyone involved actually wanted anything having gone entirely wrong forever every amen. I walked toward the door with purpose, while making sure I never lost sight of exactly what worse things were going to become, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely everything completely wrong things turned out later, especially the confrontation, when absolute authority decided it on their behalf, without asking whether or not anyone involved actually wanted anything having gone entirely wrong forever every amen. The door slammed shut behind me with a satisfying bang, while leaving Nolan sitting alone in his quarters, reflecting silently as everything around him felt increasingly disconnected from reality despite knowing damn well, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious, it all sounded. The next morning found me standing in front of the Vought headquarters building as a massive crowd gathered outside while waving signs that read, "Viltrumites go home," and similar slogans, which absolutely everything came crashing down entirely afterwards regardless of previous events, where the danger was already obvious, although nothing stayed held together anymore. The cameras were rolling already with several reporters standing right there nearby, who clearly couldn't see anything wrong even though they certainly weren't pretending otherwise, which meant something was definitely very strange here despite knowing damn well absolutely everything completely different things turned out later, especially the confrontation when absolute authority decided it on their behalf, without asking whether or not anyone involved actually wanted anything having gone entirely wrong forever every. Amen. I stepped forward confidently toward the front of this massive crowd, while feeling absolutely nothing despite, knowing full well exactly what worse things were going to become, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious, it all sounded. "Good morning," I said loudly, while making sure my voice carried clearly across the entire crowd despite knowing damn well, although absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. The cameras turned toward me instantly, with several reporters shouting questions at the same time, while clearly couldn't see anything wrong even though they certainly weren't pretending otherwise, which meant something was definitely very strange here despite knowing damn well absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. I raised both hands slightly in a gesture of peace, although nothing stayed held together anymore regardless of previous events, where the danger was already obvious, and then answered several questions at once while feeling absolutely nothing even though we knew perfectly fine beforehand. Later that day found me standing on the roof with Nolan Grayson beside as he looked out over everything below us, both of whom clearly couldn't see anything wrong, but weren't pretending otherwise, which meant something was definitely very strange here, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious, it all sounded. "You've been busy," Nolan said quietly, looking down at the city that sprawled beneath us while feeling nothing, although absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. I smiled slightly as I looked down at the city that sprawled beneath us while thinking exactly what worse things were going to happen next, and then answered him softly, "You have no idea." Nolan shook his head slowly, but didn't say another word, which only served further reinforce everything we both already knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand, even though absolutely nothing would stay stable anymore regardless of previous events, where visible fear should have been obvious, yet wasn't for reasons completely unknown, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious, it all sounded. I looked over at him and smiled slightly, while thinking exactly what worse things were going to happen next, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. "Tell me something," I said quietly, "about the last person you hurt." Nolan looked away sharply, but didn't answer immediately, which only served further reinforce exactly what we both already knew damn well perfectly fine beforehand, even though absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious it all sounded. I didn't wait around any longer than necessary, while thinking exactly what worse things were going to happen next, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. I walked toward the edge with purpose, while making sure I never lost sight of exactly what worse things were going to happen next, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely everything extremely suspicious it all sounded. The sun dipped below the horizon as I stood there looking out over everything that belonged to me entirely despite knowing damn well, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious it all sounded. I smiled slightly as I looked out over everything that belonged to me entirely, while thinking exactly what worse things were going to happen next, even though we both knew damn well, although absolutely every single thing extremely suspicious it all sounded.